Hi, this is an introduction to philosophy organized around the theme of what the ultimate questions in philosophy are. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this course offers you an introduction to some of the core questions in philosophy, as well as some of the most fundamental ways in which Western philosophers have approached the subject. The question we'll be looking at first is this: what is philosophy? And today's lecture is titled The Taxonomy of Philosophy. What I'd like to do in today's lecture is really give you an overview about what philosophy is and what it involves. So welcome and thank you very much for watching the video here. Go ahead and just begin here. Again, the title for today's lecture is The Taxonomy of Philosophy. And what is a taxonomy? Most of you probably can recall from maybe you've taken a science class or taken a different sort of class. A taxonomy is merely a system of classification. And so what we're going to be doing in this course is we're going to be asking critical questions in philosophy, the perennial questions, if you will, questions like what is truth, what is reality, what's the meaning of life, and so forth. But as we ask these questions, we're going to be involved in reading, articulating, and critiquing various answers and responses that philosophers have given, going all the way back to the ancient world. But before we get into that, it's helpful to understand the different categories of philosophy. Another metaphor for thinking about this would be you can imagine philosophy as a large city, and there's different neighborhoods. And what I want to do in this lecture is give you a sense of what those different neighborhoods are. So really though, before we sort of get into it, I want to begin with just the root word itself, philosophy. What exactly does this mean? Well, I'd encourage you right now to pause the video and really just think about this question. What exactly is philosophy from your perspective? And what do other people around you generally think philosophy is? What you'll find is that most people think of philosophy as something like a way of living life, a sort of approach to life. We're going to see that philosophy is much more rigorous. But as we go through this, it's helpful to see maybe the etymological definition. Now, what is etymology? You may or may not have heard of etymology. Etymology refers to the history of a word. So it's word history. Okay. Let's see here. I'm going to make this just a little smaller. Okay, there we go. And so what is the word history? Well, the word philosophy comes from the Greek, and it actually comes from the combination of two different words. The first here is philo, which means love, something like brotherly love. You may have even heard of this. For instance, in Greek, there's different types of love, different words for love. We only have one word for love, but we mean many different things. For instance, I can say that I love my wife, and I can say I love my brother, and those mean two different things. The sort of love we're talking about here is something like a brotherly love, if you will, not an erotic love. Eros is the Greek term for erotic love. So the first word here is love. You can think of Philadelphia, for instance, has that root word. And then the other term here comes from the Greek, which is Sophia. And what that means is wisdom. So quite literally, philosophy means something like the love of wisdom. The love of wisdom. Now, that's not exactly a helpful definition for a few reasons. One is it begs the question, what exactly wisdom is? And we'll see that's a really important and critical question in philosophy, raising the question, what exactly is wisdom? And you might even want to pause here and think about, well, what exactly is wisdom from your perspective? For instance, we're often keen to remember that, or we're often keen to ask wise people how we should live our lives. Well, close your eyes, if you will, and think about someone in your life who you would consider wise. And if you will, think about the characteristics that wisdom entails. One of the things you'll find is that oftentimes people who are wise have to have experience, and oftentimes this is reflected by their age, but not always, because there's lots of people who have a large age, they're old, but they're not wise. right? It's easy to find these people. Just go down to your local convalescent hospital and start talking to people. Some of the people you'll find there are wise, and other people don't seem so wise. So the question is, well, what exactly is wisdom, right? I think wisdom, and this is not a precise definition, but it's a helpful definition. I think of someone as wise as someone who knows what to do. So wisdom, we might sort of say, in a very rudimentary sense, is something like knowing what to do. Knowing what to do. Because it seems like the wise person does know what to do. Now, you can see here we can break this down, this idea of knowing what to do. We can break it down really into three different parts. The first part is knowing, right? You have to know something, so we're talking about knowledge in this case. And then doing, right? You actually have to act. So here we're talking about action. And then finally, knowing what. When we talk about what, we're talking about the way things are, the world, or if you will allow me, we're talking about reality. Right? So you might say that knowing what to do requires having knowledge. It also requires having knowledge about reality. And then finally, but it's not just having that knowledge, it's also acting appropriately in that reality. And what we're going to see, at least today, is that these three categories correspond to the largest and the most basic categories within philosophy. The first, and here's where you need to write this down as we're going through, if you're taking notes. The domain, or if you will, the classification of problems that deal with knowledge in philosophy are categorized under the term epistemology. And actually, the term episteme here comes from the Greek as well. And so epistemology literally means something like the study of knowledge. It is the study of knowing why it is we know the things we do and how it is we know the things we do. For instance, and I'll go over this in a little bit here about what the different types of epistemologies are. And then you'll really get a sense here of how this term can be used. Now, it's going to be important because I'm going to be using these terms throughout the entire semester. So the first category, the first subspecies, if you will, of philosophy is epistemology. Now, the study of reality is referred to in philosophy here as metaphysics. And I'm just going to start right now and apologize to all of you watching because my handwriting just doesn't look too good on this. It's hard writing. I have a stylus here, but it's often hard to write. So I'm going to apologize from the get-go here for my bad handwriting. So I hope you can bear with me. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. Metaphysics is the study of reality. And when we get to metaphysics, I want to give you a more precise definition of what metaphysics is. You can see that the term metaphysics here is actually the combination of two Greek words. The first Greek word here is meta, and that means something like beyond, going beyond. In physics, of course, you're all familiar with physics. This actually comes from the Greek term physis, which refers to the world. And so this means literally going beyond the world, going beyond the physical world in terms of reality. And so we'll talk about that here in a moment. But metaphysics is the second major category in philosophy. Now, the final category here we can get here from action, we can just quickly term ethics. Ethics. And ethics here, quite simply, is the study or the analysis of how we ought to live in the world. That is, ethics studies what's morally wrong, what's morally right, and how we can develop ourselves to live a happy life, right? And ethics is fundamentally concerned with action. Metaphysics is concerned with our understanding of reality and its substrate. And epistemology concerns our theory of knowledge and how we know that what we think we know really is true, right? It's the study of knowledge. Now, what we're going to do is these are the three categories. Now, there's other categories in philosophy here that we could talk about. For instance, we could talk about logic. And in fact, we're going to have a section later on in the semester where we will talk about logic. We're going to talk about what reasoning is in very basic terms. We could also talk about political philosophy, which in many ways is really just a subcategory of ethics, because Where ethics, we usually think of ethics as referring to ourselves in a singular individualist sense. In an individual sense, political philosophy is concerned with how the entire society should act, and that is in a governing fashion. So that is politics concerns action. So in fact, Aristotle even says that political philosophy is really just ethics, just differing in terms of scope. We can also talk about axiology or aesthetics. Axiology is oftentimes grouped underneath that ethics. Axiology refers to the logic of value, right? And of course, in ethics, we have certain values that we determine our actions upon. So axiology studies how values work and how they're related. If you will, it's the logic of value. Another one here is aesthetics. Aesthetics concerns essentially the discussion of what's beautiful, and in terms of how we understand and interpret objects of beauty, for instance. So we'll talk about these others, and there's more. I could keep going here, but I don't really want to go any further because this is an introduction course, and we're principally going to be looking at these three categories: epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. Now, you're going to see, though, that I've organized this course in terms of these critical questions, right? And our first question today is, what is philosophy? And so hopefully we can answer this. But you'll see that as we go through these questions, these categories are not always completely separate. What we're going to find is that our epistemology in many ways determines our metaphysics. And of course, metaphysics determines what can be known. That is, reality determines how we can know, and how we know determines what our metaphysics are. And of course, our ethics is also intermingled with what we know, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine we could draw lots of different lines here, and we could quickly realize that it's very, very complicated in terms of determining the clear-cut lines that differentiate epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. Sometimes, in order to answer a philosophical question, we actually have to consult epistemological, metaphysical, and ethical considerations. Usually, we're thinking of metaphysics and epistemology as linked more so than anything else. So these are the principal categories in philosophy, if you will. So let me go through here, and what I want to do, I'm going to move over here. What I want to do now is I want to sort of go through, if you will, and talk about each of these categories in more particular terms. And what I want to do is I want to lay out for you some of the most rudimentary and basic types of epistemologies that we have. So, and as well as metaphysical and ethical theories. So, epistemology. Now, there's many different types of epistemology, or many different theories of how we come to gain knowledge in the world. So let me sort of jump in and start with, I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list here, but I'm just going to sort of orient you to the basics. The first sort of epistemological position we usually refer to here as empiricism. Empiricism. Empiricism refers to the idea that knowledge is based on experience, right? So we'll just put over here experience. And usually when we say experience, we're talking about sensory experience. So that is, for instance, I know that I'm sitting here right now talking to a webcam, right, that's recording this video. How do I know that that's the case? Well, the reason I say that I know there's a webcam sitting in front of me is because I have a visual sensory experience of the web camera. And based upon that experience, I say I have knowledge. So the experience begins, if you will, from sort of sensation, sense data, if you will. And then from sense data, I articulate what's happening using language or words, right? And then that is counted as knowledge. Now, one of the questions we're gonna have here is what really counts about knowledge, because, for instance, how does one know? In order for something to be known, it has to also be true, because you can't know something that's not true. I mean, you can know that something's not true, but you can't know something that's entirely false, that doesn't exist. Knowledge is implicitly linked with the category of truth. So what is truth is an important question we're going to hit later on in the semester. So, but for now, let's just block all that out, because really I just want you to learn the basic terms here. And so experience-based theories are empirical theories, or the epistemological position is known as empiricism. The second type of position here, which is less known, would be rationalism. And rationalism is the idea that you can see the root word here is rationality or reason. And what we can say here is that the rationalist believes that some things can only be known through reason, not through experience. Now, to be clear here, the rationalist doesn't deny that experience can give us knowledge. What the rationalist is saying is that there are some things that can only be known through reason. A good example of this is mathematics, right? You can think about mathematics here. Because think about it, when you're learning the quadratic equation, for instance, which, to be honest, it's hard to, I'm not sure if I even remember it off the top of my head. It's been a while since I used it, but most of you are freshmen or sophomores or something, and so most of you remember it because you just took the class. But think about it. In order to know something, a mathematical equation is correct, that requires reason. You don't experience the quadratic equation. You have to think the quadratic equation in order to know it. Just seeing it, right, printed on the page doesn't actually help you understand it. You have to use reason. So it looks like mathematics, and think about geometry in particular here, especially we're going to talk about Plato. Plato really thinks that even though he didn't himself call himself a rationalist, we might group Plato as a rationalist philosopher in the sense that he thinks that knowledge initially must come through a process of reasoning, not through a process of experience. And mathematics is a perfect example of that. Okay, now it's interesting. Now, if you think about I'll just say it. I don't want to belabor the point too long here, but in geometry, you see the circles and the triangles and this sort of thing. But remember, when you're doing proofs in geometry, you're not doing the proofs based on looking at the picture. You're actually deducing necessary relationships with your mind. Okay? That's why, for instance, a child who's not trained in mathematics, even though they can see the circles and the triangles intersect, they can't perform geometric proofs because they don't have the rational capacity as of yet in order to complete those proofs. Or at least most little kids don't. Okay, the third sort of epistemology here, and I'm only going to give you three, so it's going to be easy for you, is skepticism. Now, skepticism is a sort of odd one because empiricism says that knowledge comes through experience. Rationalism says it comes through reason. Skepticism is the view that knowledge is not possible, right? At least the absolute skeptic. The skeptic is the person who doubts that knowledge is possible. So we might say that this is the negation of knowledge, right? The skeptic is the person who says, well, I don't think you really know that. And we're going to see, though, that, for instance, when we read a philosopher by the name of David Hume, he is both an empiricist. He thinks that knowledge comes from experience, but he's a skeptic because he thinks that if knowledge comes through experience, that means there's a lot of things that we think we know that we don't actually know. A full-bore skeptic, someone who's absolutely skeptical about everything, will be someone who denies knowledge in every case. Now, there were actually philosophers in the ancient world who did do this, but typically it becomes very difficult to argue this because if no knowledge is ever possible, then you're automatically forced to ask, well, how is it that you know that's the case? Well, you can't know it's the case, and suddenly you see there's a sort of performative contradiction that's created. So those are the three basic epistemologies I want you to know from the get-go here. It's empiricism, rationalism, and skepticism. That is knowledge from experience, knowledge via reasoning alone, and finally, the denial of knowledge, skepticism. Okay? So that's epistemology. So let's go here to our next one, which is metaphysics. This is the category that most people think of when they think of philosophy, in all likelihood. And in fact, many contemporary philosophers today actually think that metaphysics should just be crossed out and eliminated. They think it's a bankrupt category. So keep in mind, since this is a philosophy course, everything I say is somewhat debatable. or moreover has been debated and continues to be debated. So we already mentioned that metaphysics means something like beyond the physical. But I want to give you a more precise definition, and this is my definition. You're not going to find it in a textbook anywhere. Oops. But I think that it's a good definition because I think it really gets to the heart. And I'm going to type it out because I think it's so critical for you to know. We might say that metaphysics is the study of that which must necessarily be the case such that the world is as it is. Now, people oftentimes, when I give this definition or I type this out in my classes, many of my students are often sort of befuddled as to what the heck I'm talking about. What do I mean by that? Let's see if I can make that a little bigger for you. Okay. Right. So let's say this. Metaphysics is the study of that which must necessarily be the case such that the world is as it is. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Metaphysics study that which must necessarily be the case such that the world as it is. I want you to think of metaphysics as the study of the substrate of reality. The substrate of the world. Let's put that actually. Now think about it. I'm going to draw a little picture here. Imagine this is my world, right? This is all of the things I experience, right? I live in the United States. I have 2 children. I'm teaching philosophy. I speak English and so forth. I have a certain experience of the world and I have certain ways of thinking about that world, right? But the question is everything I'm experiencing is in a constant state of change, right? Everything like my children are getting older. Their faces are changing. My face, unfortunately, is also changing. I'm starting to get older. You're getting older. Everything is shifting and changing, but yet we have an experience of the world. Metaphysics tries to understand what has to be the case, what necessarily is going on, such that the world has these properties that we're experiencing. For instance, think about time, right? All of us are living in the world, and one of the a priori features of the world is that the world is in time. So that means that time must in some sense be necessary for the world, or it's a necessary part of the world. So metaphysics, for instance, tries to understand what is that substrate, what's beneath, what's behind the experience that I'm seeing. For instance, one of the problems we're going to be looking at next I think in a couple lectures here is we're going to be talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers. There's a problem in philosophy often referred to here as the problem of the one and the many. The problem of the one and the many. Again, sorry my handwriting is kind of poor. The computer's, it's difficult. But what is the problem of the one and the many? Well, it's this idea. Is that think of all the different things that exist in the world, right? Think of all the different, here I have a coffee cup, right? There's all these different things in the world that we call coffee cups. Well, what is it about all of these different things? They look different, right? Here's a coffee cup with snowflakes on it. You can go to your kitchen and look in your cupboard and you're going to see a coffee cup that looks different. And all of these things look different, and they are different. Literally, they're made up of different molecules. And yet we all call them by the same name. We call them coffee cups. Now, coffee cups is an easy example, but think of the other things in our world. Think about air, right? The molecules of air that I breathe are different than the ones you breathe, and yet we both recognize that they're the same. So metaphysics tries to understand what has to be going on such that all of these different things, the many, are somehow also the same. They're also the one, right? And that's also a famous problem in philosophy that's in many ways gets the whole project of metaphysics going from the get-go. So finally, let's say here. Oh, whoops. Let me go to red here. So what I want you to see here is that metaphysics is a study. It's about what has to necessarily be the case, which means that metaphysics is a deductive science, if you will. It follows out of deduction because out of necessity. but it's about the world ultimately, or reality. A more simplistic definition would be say that metaphysics simply just studies reality. It's how we understand what reality really is. Okay, hopefully that'll make sense. You may not be a little bit uncomfortable with the way we've defined metaphysics at this point, but I think that you'll find that as we progress through the term, that that definition actually really captures all of these different views in metaphysics. Now, what are the different types of metaphysics? And again, I'm just giving you real general sense here about the different types of metaphysics that exist. The first position we'll say here is what we might call materialism. Let me make that a little bigger. Okay, hopefully you can read that all right. Materialism. Materialism is the position that fundamentally says that reality is just matter, right? Reality equals matter. It's ultimately just made up of physical stuff. Now, we should be careful here because we can talk about materialism, and physicalism is a type of materialism, but it's not the only type of materialism. So I'm not going to go into all that right now, but you may have heard of physicalism, for instance. It'll be a question we'll come to later on, especially when we read a philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel in his famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? A great essay, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But materialism basically says that the world is made up of matter, and that's it. There's no soul. There's no hidden reality behind matter. The world is actually just matter. It's just made up of physical stuff. Now, the question though is, of course, if matter is stuff, well, what exactly is that stuff? So you can see here that a materialist has lots of questions they've got to answer. All of these philosophers do. Okay, let me switch colors here. Number 2. Whoops. Oh, for some reason it refuses to change my color. Oh well. Number 2 here. After materialism, the next sort of basic metaphysical position is known as monism. And monism is the idea that all of reality is fundamentally one. That whatever it is reality must just be one thing, monistic, right? Remember, think about, for instance, in your stereo, you can set your stereo to mono. That's just one sound coming out of all your speakers. In similar sense, the monism is the view that reality is fundamentally unitary in nature. It's fundamentally one thing. And when we get to a philosopher by the name of Parmenides and Zeno, he's a pre-Socratic philosopher, you'll see there's some very interesting arguments related to monism here. And maybe it's true, right? Think about it. Maybe a sort of simplistic way of beginning to just think about what monism is think about the idea that everything is always changing, right? So if everything is always changing, right, think about my hand is getting older, and actually quite literally, all of the molecules and atoms in my body are constantly in a process of being replaced. So quite literally, right, I am a new person every day. So are you. Every moment of every day, in fact, I become literally, physically a new being. Now, wait a second. If that's the case, that means that all things are constantly changing from one thing into another. But if all things are constantly changing, why is it that we understand the world as being somehow stable and consistent? And the answer would have to be is that maybe fundamentally all of this change is an illusion. And that maybe even though it looks like things are changing, it would require our understanding, our cognizance of reality through reason would require that somehow the universe be fundamentally unitary in nature. Now, that probably I don't think is the best explanation. And I think when we get to our video on Zeno, and by the time you've seen this, you're welcome to probably zip ahead and watch that section on Parmenides and Zeno, and you'll get a much better understanding of what monism is. But monism, to put simplistically, just says that reality is fundamentally one. Now, this third major position in metaphysics is known as dualism. And I'm willing to bet that most of you are dualist. Now, what is dualist? Well, if monism is one, well, dualism is the idea that reality has fundamentally two parts, right? Reality is dualistic, right? And to give you a great example of this, if you're a Christian, for instance, or a Muslim, then in all likelihood you're a dualist because you probably believe that the world is composed of two different things. On the one hand, it's composed of the world, and on the other hand, it's composed of heaven, right? Or, if you will, the physical world and the spiritual world, if you want to use that language. And that, for instance, classical Christians believe that there is this heavenly world, but this heavenly world is not physical, which means that you can't see it when you're in the physical body, right? But it is real. And simultaneously, the physical world is also real. So they're both real. So reality is dualistic in nature. This is what we might call a dualism. Now, there are different types of dualism. We'll see that there's Christian dualism, for instance. There's also what we might call Platonic dualism, in which Plato says there's two realms, being and becoming. We'll come to that later. Or another philosopher we'll look at is René Descartes, who's also known as a dualist. He thinks there's two types of reality. There's the mental, the realm of the mind, and the physical, the realm of the body, mind and body. So this is a dualistic type of metaphysics. Now, are there, though we're not going to give one, there actually are metaphysics that say reality is made of three. I won't go into that right now because there's no major philosophers who really argue that. An American philosopher by the name of Peirce argues something to that effect. The fourth type here, after dualism, we might say that I want to give you is idealism, right? Well, actually, let me go back here. If materialism is about matter, idealism says that reality is fundamentally made up of ideas. Reality is fundamentally made up of ideas. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what? This is crazy. How could that be the case, right? If someone throws a rock at me, it doesn't feel like an idea is hitting me, right? Well, let's think about it for a moment. And we'll come to this later in the semester as well, and I'll explain it in a more thorough fashion. But think about it like this. Let's imagine that, for instance, it's your birthday, right? And someone buys you a present. Unfortunately, they didn't wrap it well. It's all crooked, right? So here's a bow, right? You get a present for your birthday. And here you are. Let's draw a picture of you. You're not going to look too good. Okay, so you have an ugly head. Sorry about that. Right, but there's your ear and there's your eye. Okay, now let me erase that. So here you are, right? So let's imagine when someone gives you a Christmas present, what happens? Well, first off, or a birthday present. First off, you see the present, right? So somehow the light waves bounce off the light, and then they bounce into your eye, and you see the present. Now, but keep in mind that seeing the present is not enough in itself, right? Because seeing the present, just your eyeball just gets a light wave, and it's an organ, and it sort of manipulates the light waves upside down, and then somehow signals are sent from your eye into your brain, right? Where you have, if you will, a little picture of the present in your mind. Right? So if you will, there's the present. There's three moments. There's the present. The light wave hits your eye. There's the sensory experience. But then finally, there's the mental understanding, number three. The mental understanding, right? So you have the object. We'll just call this the sensation. And then finally, you have the idea, right? You have the idea of the present in your head. Okay, now, but wait a second. Let's think about it for just a moment. And here, I'm going to change the color of my pen. Okay, so you have these three different moments. And by the way, again, this comes from John Locke, a famous philosopher. You've probably heard of him. Now, but wait a second. Every experience I have of the world is always given through sensation, right? So think about the different ways I could see the present. I could see the present. The different ways I could sense the present. I could see the present with my eyes. I could feel it with my hands. I could knock on it and hear it. I could smell it, right? I could even taste the present. It would be kind of odd. I won't pretend to do that, right? But everything I know about the world comes from those sensations, right? because I have these five sensations, right? Feeling, sight, smell, hearing, and taste, right? But what happens if you take away my sense organs, right? What happens if you take away my ability to see? Well, now I can't see the present. I could feel it, I guess. Well, what if you take away my hearing? I become deaf. Well, now I can't hear the present, but I could touch it, right? And let's imagine I get some sort of disease of the nerves, and now I can't even feel the present. Well, I could still smell, and I'd have to be a good smelling present, I guess. I could smell the present. I could taste the present. If you cut out my tongue, then now I can only smell the present, right? But imagine, for instance, some my olfactory organs are injured, and now I can't even smell. So I can't see, I can't touch, I can't hear, I can't taste, I can't smell, I guess. So if you take away all of my organs, that is, if you take away my ability to have sensation, what happens? Well, I lose my ability to have the object, right? Now I don't know that the object exists. So you can see, but I could still have the idea, right? Now, but here's the thing. Go back a little bit, if you will. Let me see if I can erase my little lines here. Right? So let's go back to our model. Here's what happens is, wait a second, how do I ever know that my idea, right? In order for me to have knowledge, my idea of the present should be equal, whoops, right? Should be identical with, right? Should be equal with the object, right? So in order for me to have true knowledge, my idea of the present in my mind has to be the same as the object that I'm actually perceiving. But because all of my senses are always, all of my ideas come through sensation here, then that would mean that all I really ever have access to are ideas. Because how can I ever verify, how can I ever check to make sure that my idea of the present actually corresponds accurately with the real present? Well, the only way I could ever do that is to use my sensations, but my sensations, the problem is I can't get out of my sensations to verify that my ideas are correct. And so what does idealism say? Well, idealism says this whole model of object to sensation to idea is problematic. It's because we can never know for sure that our sensations are ever accurately judging the objects. So we might as well just stop talking about this stuff. And instead, let's just talk about the ideas, because after all, that's what we know we really do have. I know that I have an idea of the webcam in front of me, but I can never know that my idea of the web camera is actually true without using my senses and my other ideas. So maybe all of reality is fundamentally just ideas, right? Maybe there is no physical reality. Maybe it truly is all mental, right? Now, there's different types of idealisms. I think the most famous idealist we're going to cover is a philosopher by the name of George Berkeley. And then there's another philosopher. We're not going to be covering him. I'll probably mention him in my in one of the class sessions, but we're not going to be reading him. And his name's Hegel, and he's a much more sophisticated idealist. But he thinks that literally, as we, and his idealism is different than what I've formulated here. But his notion is that as history progresses, ideas evolve, and as these ideas evolve, it changes our sense of what the world is, and thereby changes reality. Now, I'm putting this very simplistically, but maybe a good example of a sort of idealism here. Now, you can see here, idealism in philosophy clearly does not mean what we typically think of in terms of idealism, which is something like people are hopeful, or they have, they're positive in nature. Idealism here refers to a metaphysics, a view that reality is fundamentally just ideas. Right. Let me give you an example here that maybe will help you understand this. How many of you have heard of political correctness? Political correct language. Now, ask yourself, for instance, I remember it was really this sort of thing became, the idea of politically correct language really came, at least I remember it sort of coming into the fore in the 1990s. But what is the idea of politically correct language? It's the idea that there's certain words we shouldn't use in public life because those words are negative in some fashion. And the idea is that we need to somehow correct that negativity. So, for instance, think about In fact, this happens with, it's not just politically correct language, it actually happens with many, with any taboo language at all. But think about the idea that, um, I'm trying to think of, let's think about the idea of the difference between, we can refer to, today we typically refer to Native Americans, not Indians. And what we're talking about is the original inhabitants of the United States. Um, right? Originally, they were called Indians, and we called them Indians. We still do to many up to this day. In fact, there's a lot of debate about whether or not we should still have sports teams called the Indians or the Redskins and this sort of stuff. Is that appropriate? Why? Well, in America, there's obviously a history of decimating the native population, right? Essentially, the colonists from Europe came and they annihilated, for all intents and purposes, they annihilated the native culture and then replaced it with the European culture, the culture that we exist in today. Now, originally we called them Indians because when I say we, I mean people in the United States refer to the native inhabitants as Indians. But that at some point we decided that that was problematic because the word Indian here refers to a misunderstanding of Europeans during the colonial process, right? They thought that they were in India, and so they called them Indians. And that whole history is itself tainted. And it is a dark history. Think about the idea that we rarely actually talk about it, and it was essentially, in all intents and purposes, an American genocide. So, in order to correct it, we say, well, let's not use the term Indian. Let's use the term Native American. And the idea is that if we change the idea, maybe we can change the reality, right? That we have a troubling reality in terms of the way the native inhabitants were treated. If we change our language and change our ideas, maybe we'll change the reality. We'll change how we treat these people. And in many ways, this has actually been helpful, I think, especially in terms of the advancement of civil rights in the United States. So many people complain about politically correct language. I'm not so much against it myself, but I will say this, is that those people who are in favor of politically correct language are in many ways either by default sympathetic or maybe explicitly idealist in this metaphysical sense. If we change our ideas, we can change our reality. That at least gives you a sense of the reasoning, for instance, behind something like politically correct language. Okay, so there are other metaphysical positions, of course. We could talk about nihilism, for instance, which is well, no, not nihilism, I'm sorry. We could talk about others. I won't go into them. But the main ones I want you to know here is materialism, monism, dualism, and idealism. Okay, now for the fun stuff. Ethics. The different types of ethical theories, okay? Let me just go over this. The first one here is going to be relativism. Relativism, now ethics, of course, is the study of how we ought to act, right? How one ought to act. And we can make a distinction. When we get to this point, of course, I'll make a distinction here between ethics and morality. But at this point, just think of the two as synonymous. It's the study of what's wrong and right in terms of our actions and how we ought to conduct ourselves. So relativism, often referred to here as cultural relativism, in fact, we have a whole session, I think, devoted to the topic, is the idea that how people ought to act is dependent on their situation in some fashion or another. That is, it is relative to their circumstance or to their person. So, for instance, cultural relativism is a type of relativism that says that, well, how people act in Iran it can be justified, but isn't necessarily justified here in America. Let me give you an example. Why am I picking on Iran? Iran, for instance, if you, it depends, of course, in their judicial system, but if you commit theft in Iran, what's one of the legal punishments that they can do? Well, if you commit theft, they can chop one of your hands off, right? Now, if in the United States, for instance, if you did this, if you went to Barnes & Noble and you stole a book, right, and they caught you, what would happen if they chopped off your hand as a punishment? Well, Barnes & Noble would be shut down, right? It would be considered a crime, cruel and unusual punishment. But yet, while cutting someone's hand off as a punishment is illegal in the United States, it is legal in fact, it's legal in Iran. So think about it. Who's wrong and who's right? Is Iran right, or are the Americans right? Well, the relativist says, well, it's relative to your culture, right? So if you live in Iran, then that would be a justifiable punishment. If you live in an American culture, that would not be a justifiable punishment. So there's cultural relativism. There's also personal relativism too. I find that many of my students are relativist in this fashion. They think, well, to each their own, right? Essentially, well, that's your personal view. So, and this is my personal view. We'll just agree to disagree. Everyone's right. But the problem with relativism is that relativism has a nice way of dealing with the fact that there's different forms of moral life, right? Because there are different forms of moral life. But where relativism has a big problem is that it seems to inhibit. Here, I'll put this. It inhibits moral judgments. Sorry, it's hard to read there. But it inhibits making moral judgments. For instance, if I'm a true relativist and I think that every person should just decide for themselves how they ought to live, and what's wrong is determined by each individual person, and there's no universal sort of facts that govern what's wrong and what's right. Well, as a relativist, that means that if I see you committing a crime, well, wait a second, do I really have the right to make a moral judgment about you, to say you're living the wrong kind of life? For instance, now we gave the example of Iran and cutting hands off. That's more extreme. Let's think about a much more ordinary example. Let's, for instance, think about you. Let's think about a person, two different people. One person decides to have an abortion, and another person who's pregnant decides not to have an abortion. Right? Now, abortion is a really hot topic for most people. So most of us already have a disposition one way or another. But think about it. If you're a true relativist, you are really inhibited from making a moral judgment about someone else. You can say, I personally think abortion's okay, but do I have the right to tell someone else that they're wrong about their view? Well, if you're a relativist, you don't really have that capacity. But the problem, though, is that when push comes to shove, we all actually have to live. And we all do make moral judgments. So relativism is very problematic, because ultimately relativism becomes self-contradictory, unless you have some sort of modified terms of relativism. Anyway, in a very basic sense, that's what relativism is, and we'll talk about it. And by the way, this problem of relativism goes all the way back to Plato. It's been a problem for a long time. Okay, relativism. What's another ethical position? Egoism. Egoism is the idea that people ought to pursue self-interest. Pursue your own self-interest. Pursue your own self-interest. That you ought to pursue it. So, for instance, that means that how should I live my life? How should I make my choices in terms of my action? I should pursue what's in my self-interest, not what's in your self-interest. For instance, egoism is against altruism, for instance. Altruism is the idea of doing something to help someone else purely for the sake of helping that other person. The egoist says that that's problematic. A famous egoist in this, 20th century egoist you may have heard of, is Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand argues that altruism is a self-defeating sort of thing and problematic as a result. So, egoism says pursue your own self-interest. If it's not in your self-interest, don't do it. So, for instance, think about what would the egoist say about tithing, right? Should you give money to a church? Well, is it in your self-interest to do so is the question. Well, if you like going to that church and you want to maintain that church's existence, then yeah, it's in your self-interest perhaps. But is it in, or maybe it's not in your self-interest. Maybe it's in the interest of someone else, right? And so you can see here the egoist is going to splice up their understanding of action and their what's required to live a good life based upon what their understanding of their own self-interest, right? So that's sort of egoism, okay? And there are different types of egoism, but we won't go through them here, including emotivism and these others. The next one here is hedonism. I think many of my students are hedonists. Hedonism is pleasure-centered ethics. Pleasure-centered ethics. It's the idea that you ought to pursue pleasure. Now, there are different types of hedonism. I usually refer to what we might call vulgar or bodily hedonism, where that's sort of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of ethics. That's if it feels good, do it physically. That's usually a bad way. The more sophisticated form of hedonism would be what we refer to as Epicureanism, coming from an ancient Greek philosopher by the name of Epicurus. And he argues that you should pursue pleasure, but here with a major caveat. You should pursue pleasure, but you should avoid pain, right? And guess what? Some pleasures cause pain, and those pleasures should be pursued. So for instance, think about this. I love giving this example to my classes. Think about, for instance, if you go to any nightclub on a Saturday night, right? Some of you are going to be at a nightclub this weekend, maybe, I don't know. But if you go to a nightclub on a Saturday night at 1 in the morning, look around. Everyone is in pleasure, or at least most people are. They're having a good time. They're drinking, they're dancing, they're laughing, right? Everyone seems to be having a good time. But ask yourself, where are most of those people going to be in 7 or 8 hours? The answer is they're going to be in bed with a horrible hangover, right? Because they drank too much. So the hedonist would say, the Epicurean would say, for instance, you should pursue pleasure, but you should avoid pain, which means you should avoid those pleasures that cause pain. For instance, you should avoid drunkenness. So even though being drunk may feel good at the moment, since it causes pain, we should avoid it. So this is a type of pleasure-centered ethics, or a hedonism, right? So there's hedonism for you. I think most of my students maybe are hedonists, but not Epicureans, if you will. Okay, number 4, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that you ought to pursue the greatest amount of happiness. I'll just put the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. I'll just put the greatest number of people. Okay? So utilitarianism, the root word here is utility, right? What is a utility? Think about your bills you pay. What is a utility? A utility is something you use. And the idea of the utilitarian is that our actions, right, are things that we use, right? We use our actions to promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, Okay? So that means that whether or not something's wrong or right, whether or not a specific action is wrong or right, take our abortion example, right? The utilitarian would say, well, abortion is wrong if it does not promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. A utilitarian would also say that an abortion would be correct or morally right if that abortion does promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. For instance, maybe some of you have heard of actually it's not that recent anymore, a book called, I forgot the name of it off the top of my head. It'll come to me. I'm sorry. Freakonomics. Thank you. I'm sorry. There's a great book called Freakonomics where they analyze economics. They use essentially economic analysis to look at social problems. And one of the arguments made in that is that there's a huge, if you look in the history of the United States, around after the 1960s, crime steadily rises. Up until the 1990s, and there's suddenly a drop in crime. And actually, we're still experiencing a drop in crime today, overall. Now, of course, certain cities like Chicago are worse off than others. But overall, there's less and less crime, right? So actually, America's becoming safer and safer in terms of violent crime. Well, you wouldn't think that from watching the news, but it's actually statistically true. Now, what's made in this argument is that why is it? Where did the drop in crime come from? At the time, and still today, many people, for instance, in the criminal justice side of the house, they argue that it's because of new innovative crime techniques, right? The problem is that none of those crime techniques, right, stop and frisk and so forth, that none of these crime techniques actually show statistical relevance. But there is one major factor that does show statistical relevance, and that is abortion. That is, after the legalization of abortion in the 1970s under the Roe v. Wade decision, many more people started having abortions. And what that effectively has done is that we've seen an effect is that the argument's made that because of those abortions, many of those people who weren't born because they were aborted would have, in all likelihood, ended up in a criminal situation. Why? Because we know that many people who Many mothers who decide to have an abortion decide to do so because they don't think they can raise a child effectively. Um, and we know that the children who are raised by parents who don't want them do poorly. And there's a greater likelihood of those children becoming criminals. And so the argument's made is that by the time you get to the 1990s, that generation of people that would have existed doesn't exist. And so crime begins to fall. Now, whether or not that's actually true, I don't know. I encourage you to read the chapter in Freakonomics and you decide for yourself. You can do the mathematics and determine your own view. But we can at least use it as an example when we talk about utilitarianism. The idea here would be that under this view, if it's true that abortion was reduced because, crime was reduced because of abortion, and of course, the reduction in crime is something we all benefit for, that would mean that the greatest, why does it do this? That would mean that the greatest amount of happiness is actually being met, and thus, by definition, the use of abortion would be morally right. Right, morally correct. So the utilitarian sees our actions as utilities, and so this is often referred to as consequentialism, a type of consequentialism. And I'll say this is that consequentialism is the idea that actions are justified based upon the consequences that ensue from those actions. So if the consequence is good, then we say that the action is good. Utilitarianism is one form of that. Now, the next one here, let's see, actually, what number? Let's see, I'm sorry. Oh, we're on number 5. Right, so the fifth sort of ethical theory to talk about here would be deontology. I only have 2 more to give you, and then we'll wrap this up. I know that's taking a while. Deontology. Deontology is the notion of duty-based ethics. And there's really one fundamental deontologist that we'll be looking at in this class, and his name is Immanuel Kant. And what he argues, just to put it simply, is that we have certain universal moral duties, and to live morally right is to conform and to meet those duties, right? To fulfill those duties. And what he argues, for instance, is that those duties are universal, meaning that we can't disregard them. So, for instance, he says, for instance, we should never treat another person as a means, right? You should never treat another person simply as an instrument, a tool, right? Because that person has moral value in themselves. As a result, Immanuel Kant argues that we would have a duty to never treat another person as a means, and this example of an abortion, using abortion to drop crime, is precisely something that he would be troubled with. Because there we're saying that your life is just a tool, and if we get rid of your life, we can use that killing, if you will, as a way to reduce crime. And he would be against that, absolutely. Because his view would be, no, you're using the unborn fetus here as a tool, and when in fact you should treat that unborn fetus as having value for its own sake. So deontology is any ethical system that says, listen, we have duties to act, and we have to fulfill those duties. And those duties are those duties can't be compromised. Okay? Let me move here to number 6, the last one here. I think it's the last theory. Sorry, someone's calling me, and I'm trying to ignore the phone. The last one here is, actually, there's 2 more here. The last one, or the second to last one here, is virtue theory. And this is principally this form of ethical theory that existed in the classical world. And the person we're going to be looking at in this regard is Aristotle. But virtue theory says this: instead of looking at the question of what, that is, what actions are wrong and which actions are right, we shouldn't look at the question of what, we should look at the question of who. That is, we should develop good characters. That is, we should become virtuous people, right? And if we are virtuous people, then we'll tend to make virtuous and good decisions. So virtue theory says, listen, the point isn't to figure out which actions are wrong or right based upon their utility or our duty. The point is to determine how we can build our characters and to become virtuous people, because good people tend to do good things. Whereas, for instance, just doing a good thing doesn't make you a good person. So you might say that virtue theory really focuses here on the question of who we are and how we can be better people. The last position I'll give here, which is really a sort of base, it's not so much an ethical system as it is a sort of a catch-all for a number of different ethical views. And there's the notion of subjectivism. Subjectivism says this. It says that there are no moral facts, right? That there are no moral facts, that ultimately all of our views, all of our moral beliefs are basically come from the subject. They come from us. There's a classic distinction in philosophy known as the subject-object split, right? The subject-object split says that there's objects in the world and there's subjects that perceive those objects, right? You can think about the, let's see here, remember I talked about the, let's see if I can find it here, my little, I don't know where it is. I was going to look at my picture, maybe I erased it, I think I did. My little picture I did here of the Christmas present out here. There's an object out here in the world and I see it in my mind, right? This is the mind. And this is the world. This is the object. And I am the subject. And what subjectivism says is that ethics does not exist in the world. It only exists in the mind of the subject. So that means that subjectivism says, listen, there is a wrong and right way to live in the world, but ultimately our values are seated within ourselves. They don't exist in the world. We can't look at nature to determine how we ought to live. We have to look to ourselves. Now, subjectivism gets very close to relativism, but we have to make a differentiation here because not all subjectivists are relativist. Though I would say that almost all relativists are probably subjectivist in some degree, right? But we're going to talk about all of this stuff as we go throughout the semester. What I'm hoping, though, is that this is a sort of basic, let me see if I can make it smaller. This is a sort of basic taxonomy of philosophy, right? Just a sort of brief review. If philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? And wisdom can be understood in terms of how we know things, epistemology, what the world is, metaphysics, and finally how to act, ethics, what we end up with are, let me make it a little bigger. What we end up with are these sorts of positions, right? Epistemology, empiricism, rationalism, skepticism, right? Metaphysics, we have materialism, monism, dualism, idealism. And finally, in ethics, we have a whole number of theories: relativism, egoism, hedonism, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue theory, and subjectivism. Now, that's a lot of different terms I've given you for today, and I don't expect you to, anyone in this class at this point, to really understand these terms in their full sense. But this sort of gives you a roadmap of the different types of ideas that get discussed in philosophy and the different ways in which we can classify different types of views or arguments. So this is the taxonomy of philosophy, and I think that you're going to find that it's very helpful as we go forward. Now, our next video here is going to be on the unexamined life. The next video or lecture here is the unexamined life is not worth living. And that lesson is going to focus in on the life of Socrates and really give you a sense of someone who I think embodies what it would mean not just to think about philosophy, but really to live philosophy. Okay, thank you very much for watching the video. I look forward to seeing you guys online. Talk to you later.